I just want to thank you all for coming. I'm Nia Chiotich. I'm the Executive Director of the Montauk Historical Society. I wanted to thank you for coming to help us commemorate the 70th anniversary of the tragic sinking of the Pelican, which happened on a Labor Day weekend in 1951. We have some family members of victims of that as we're here today. And as we think about the people who lost their lives in that horrible event and those whose lives were forever shaped by it, I'd just like to ask you to look out to see where there's a Coast Guard boat. And in a few moments, they will be laying a wreath near the place where the Pelican sank.
Eternal Father, strong to save, whose arm doth guide the restless wave, who bids the mighty ocean deep its own appointed limits keep. Oh, hear us when we cry to thee, for those in peril on the sea. O Savior, whose almighty word the winds and waves submissive heard, who walkest on the foaming deep, and calm amidst its rage did sleep. Oh, hear us when we cry to thee, for those in peril on the sea. Most Holy Spirit, who didst brood upon the chaos dark and rude, and bid its angry tumult cease, and gave us light and life and peace. Oh, hear us when we cry to thee, for those in peril on the sea. O Trinity of love and power, our brethren shield in danger's hour, from rock and tempest, fire and foe, protect them wheresoe'er they go. Thus evermore shall rise to thee glad hymns of praise from land and sea.
Thank you, ladies and gentlemen, and I want to thank particularly the Montauk Historical Society and those ladies and gentlemen who put so much time into the history of Montauk to keep the memorial going for such tragedies as the sinking of the Pelican. I'm Joe McBride. I'm the past president and founder of the Montauk Boatmen and Captains Association. I do have a young lady I'd like to introduce here, Faye Pakula. Come on up here, young, if you don't mind. Her two uncles were on the Pelican, and she came here in respect to her uncles, and and I might be another person here somewhere that had family. Come on up here, sir. Forgive me, I didn't get your name, sir.
I was born in June of 1951, and my dad died on September 1st. I flew in from Louisiana for this event. My son flew in from Los Angeles, and we're thankful to have this. Really, it means an awful lot to us.
Absolutely wonderful to see such a crowd at this really auspicious and important commemoration today. I want to thank Nia for putting this all together. Astonishing to the families who've come to be part of this. It's my pleasure and my honor to present our author, Tom Clavin, old friend. Tom has authored or co-authored 10 books, but if you look online, you'll see another 20 books that he's contributed to in one way or another. So it's an impressive 30 book total. And I'm sure you're hard at work on the next one.
In fact, I have to leave in a few minutes.
Oh, okay. I'm sorry, I'll cut it short.
Thanks for joining us. We're going to try to keep this as interesting and informative as possible. I had a chance to read the book for the first time after Mia invited me to interview Tom, and I'm glad I had the opportunity to do it because I thought it was a wonderful, wonderful book, and it was a terrible tragedy, but it is a great story, well told. Montauk, I'm quite confident, Montauk of 2021 is much different than it was in 1951 when the Pelican went down. Tom, I was wondering if you could just talk for a minute to give us, kind of orient us a little bit about the time and place. This is after World War II and the changes that are occurring across Long Island.
Yeah, that was one of the enjoyable, of a very difficult story to tell. One of the enjoyable aspects of researching it was trying to recreate Montauk of 1951. Now, I worked on this book starting for about I'm going to say about 3 or 4 years. 2001, the book was published 2005. So in 2001, you're talking about 50 years later, there's an enormous difference doing the research to find out about Fish Shangri-La, to find out about where the railroad station was in those days and how the Fisherman's Special came in and went right up to the docks. The way that there were head boats, party boats, charter boats, to find out that what the typical patterns were for the captains in the mornings when they were taking passengers out, and how much so, I mean, it still is to some extent, but certainly in 1951, a trip to Montauk for a lot of people, especially coming from New York City, was really a trip to the end. You know, it was far, far, far away, and as Captain McBride pointed out, it was a 3-hour drive at least. You know, you didn't have the expressway coming out to exit 70. The train rides, even with the Fisherman's Special, it was a long trip, and for people it was very exciting to have the post-war. A lot of the people who came out had served perhaps in the military, and they had come home and found jobs, started families, started to have a little bit of extra money, and they could come out fishing. $4.50 for the day for fishing. I mean, you can't even get a lobster sandwich in Montauk for that anymore.
Not even a bite.
No. You get a photo of a lobster sandwich from the Historical Society. So that was one of the, I think, the aspects of it that really intrigued me, is to try as best I could, not having been here myself in 1951 Montauk, but to try and recreate what it was like and give a sense of why it was a place that these people wanted to spend their money, spend all that time getting out there, because many of these people, they only had Saturday and Sunday. You know, they had to be back at work on Monday. Maybe they couldn't get off work early enough on Friday. So it was a lot, and they had to say goodbye to wives and children in some cases too. So why? What was special about it? The getaway it was, much more so than 70 years later.
What was special about it?
Well, I think what was special about it is it was a different world. You know, people who lived in the Bronx, who lived in Brooklyn, who lived in Queens and Manhattan, you know, very much an urban experience. The urban experience probably doesn't change over the decades as much. But when you came out to Montauk in 1951, there was the quiet of it. Everybody knew each other. It was basically like going to Middle America in a sense, because you came out to a community that a lot of families were there for multi-generations. And so it was really experiencing something that they would not otherwise have had a chance to experience in their urban environment.
How did you come across the story?
It was, as a lot of times what happens, certainly with me, when a book idea comes along, it was kind of accidental, serendipitous. In September 1, 2001, Newsday, I think it was only the page 4 or page 6, and it was the left-hand page, they did an interview with Irene Stein. And Irene Stein lost both her husband and her father on the Pelican. Her husband John and Andrew Colasar, who was her father. And I found that remarkable to go through such loss in what was a peacetime event, and they mentioned the Pelican and the loss of life, and I found that so fascinating that I wanted to know more, because Irene Stein, I mean, the story of her father and her father and her husband were just two of the 46, 45 victims of that Pelican capsizing. I thought each one of these people had a story who perished, even the ones who survived too. Survivors and those who perished each had a story. So I wanted to find out what those stories were. I wanted to, I guess if I was able to do a book about it, which is not guaranteed by any means when I started working on this, that it would be maybe a way to pass on who these people were, and also the idea that because of this tragedy, as Captain McBride mentioned, there was a lot of changes in regulations, which in the interim saved hundreds, if not thousands, of lives. So that was it. Just happened to see it. Irene Stein's interview. At the time, I worked at the Independent newspaper, which doesn't exist anymore, but there was the East Hampton Independent, and there was a mutual acquaintance. I don't know if anybody knows Coco. He and his brother ran the Twins Inn for many years. And Coco said, I have a friend who dedicated her early life when she was very young to collecting everything that she saw published about the Pelican tragedy. She's got this great scrapbook. So I won't mention her name. But so Coco arranged that I would go visit her on her day off. And I went to visit her in her house. It was in East Hampton. And she, on her day off, she was enjoying gin and tonics. And so she brought her scrapbook out, which was amazing. She had become so fascinated by it that everything that she could see that was in the Daily News, that was in the Daily Mirror. I mean, in 1951 in New York, I think that New York City had something like 9 or 10 newspapers. The Journal American, some of you remember some of the Tribune. So she had this scrapbook of page after page after page of coverage and mentioning, you know, the survivors, the story, all the reporting that was done. It was a gold mine. And so I said, listen, I would love to, my office is 10 minutes away. Can I bring the scrapbook over there and make copies of all these pages? And she said, no, I couldn't possibly let sight of it out of my sight. It's a treasure of mine. I want to eventually leave it to my daughter. And finally, after 3 more gin and tonics, she went to sleep. So, and I was glad, I felt I wasn't taking advantage of her, because when she fell asleep in her chair, she still had a lit cigarette. Took the cigarette out, stamped it out, grabbed the scrapbook, booked to my office, Xerox, came back. I just walked back in the door, put the scrapbook down, and she said, and she wakes up and she said, oh, I'm sorry, how long have I been asleep? I said, 5 minutes. So that was a great beginning to it, and then at least I had more names to try and contact, and probably a longer answer than you anticipated. But then it was just a matter of starting to contact people who had some connection to the event, and that's what I did. And it was really the great generosity of the Montauk community, and especially people who had a connection. You know, captains like Bob Tuma, who'd been out on that day, Frank Tuma, other people, that I started to collect more and more information. And then got really lucky, because you can collect a lot of information and not be able to do anything with it, but I found a publisher willing to say, okay, we'll take a chance on this story and go for it. That's what I did.
Well, it started out as a beautiful day, and it was full of promise.
Yes.
What went wrong?
Well, a couple of things that went wrong is that, and I'm no meteorological expert, but I ended up talking to somebody with the Oceanographic Institute who still had these records of September 1, 1951, that talked about this meeting of really 3 different storm systems. One came over the Midwest, one came down here, one came across here. And so it wasn't a perfect storm. I mean, the perfect storm situation that Sebastian Junger wrote about was massive storm. I mean, those were massive storms. This was more like a combination of storms that formed one really nasty, fast-moving storm. The other thing is that obviously now we have the technology that if there's a extra puff of air off the coast of Africa, they can tell us about a hurricane that's going to hit 2 weeks later. In those days, you didn't have radar. You had radar, but they really was not doing it. They couldn't really use it as a weather forecasting piece of equipment. What the Fish Shangri-La, Gene Goebel, who was the manager there and co-owner, one of his ways to try and find out what weather might be happening is he would get calls from like Pan Am and TWA pilots. Here's what I'm seeing. Here's what I'm flying over this system, and that was high tech, you know, for then. So you really had a combination of a fast-forming and fast-moving storm system, and the inability until it was almost too late to see what the weather's going to be. I mean, some people had a sixth sense for weather, but a lot of people didn't. They were just relying on, hey, it's a great day, let's go. There's no reason not to.
So this is really, I mean, it's a story about the weather as well as the fishing. What did you learn about weather and meteorology as a result of this?
Well, certainly how unpredictable it can be off Montauk. You know, all of these, how experienced were many of these captains going out that day? A lot of them had years and years of experience, and they didn't really have, most of them, any kind of sixth sense that said, you know, as beautiful as the day is, we're seeing a sign here or a sign there. It's just how fast some things can happen, how you have to be prepared for it, and how quickly things can change. You know, they went out that morning, 8 o'clock, 8:30, 9 o'clock that morning. It was a beautiful day. Thank you. Beautiful day, and then it was dark noon. You know, by noon the sky was black. This horrible storm had overtaken the boats out there. Thankfully, most of the captains had the desire and the ability to get back to port before things got really, really bad. The Pelican was not that fortunate. The Pelican was not the only one still out there. There was the Bingo too, and there was the Betty Ann still out there. Thankfully.
Captain McBride talked a little bit earlier about the long ride that people would take and the dozens, if not hundreds, of fishermen that would come out. Can you talk a little bit about what the scene might have been like and what Captain Eddie Carroll might have had to deal with the morning of all those people getting on board?
Yeah, Captain Carroll had several things to consider. One was that, as Captain McBride alluded to, he was really concerned about his passengers. A lot of these, as the book points out, quite a few of the people that went on the Pelican were return anglers. You know, they'd been with Captain Carroll, or maybe his brother Howie Carroll before. They were on the Pelican. The Pelican had Captain Carroll was a Navy veteran. He was a raconteur. He was a good storyteller. A lot of times people wanted to be on his boat because when things were kind of slow and they were out there in the water, hey, Captain Eddie, could you tell us this story about such and such? And they enjoyed hearing his stories. And he enjoyed that rapport, that connection to his passengers. They weren't just faceless passengers. You had the train that was coming in with, the train itself was overloaded. There's a scene that always I thought was remarkable in the book when I was writing it, that the train hadn't even stopped yet and people were hurling themselves out the window of the train. Because if you don't want to be left behind. If you don't act fast enough, you might not get on a boat. And you came all the way, 3.5 hours, 4 hours, however long it took. You left your house at 3 o'clock in the morning all the way to come out here, and you don't end up getting on a boat, let alone not getting on the boat you wanted to get on. So I think the frenzy of these people coming out, all this pent-up energy, because they've just been sitting on a train for 3+ hours. And finally they were here. And this is what they've been waiting for. This could have been what they were thinking of all during their work week. You know, they were having, when somebody was a subway conductor, you know, it's not the most exciting job, but you know what, on Saturday I'm going to be in Montauk fishing. You know, and then the time comes and they wanted to make sure that this is what they had a chance to do. So, and Captain Carroll, like any of the captains there, some were able to pay more attention than others. I think it also depended on how experienced your first mate was, because your first mate is supposed to kind of be helpful to you, and how many passengers are on your boat. And the first mate, in the case of the Pelican, seemed to lose track, seemed to lose count. Eddie underestimated what was on his boat. So I think when you see what's on the cover, when you see photographs of the Pelican leaving the dock and see how overloaded it is, they were already away from the dock when I think it really hit Captain Carroll. Oh my God, I had no idea there were that many people. What are you going to do at that point? Turn around, come back to the dock and say, you, get off. That's not going to happen. And again, if there was an indication that they were going to hit bad weather, maybe you do something like that. But it was probably a day like this in September.
And some considered Eddie Carroll a lucky captain. They wanted to be on his boat. And did some of them kind of squirrel themselves away inside the cabin so that they wouldn't be seen?
That was a way to not have a full count. You know, don't get noticed. You counted as a head boat. They counted heads. If they couldn't see your head, they didn't count you. So that was one way to get around it. Unfortunately, people didn't quite realize that by doing so, by being a little bit obscure with their person, that they were contributing to the boat being overloaded. And so when it was only when these people they were out on the water, some of these people popped out. Here we are, you know, and when can we start fishing? That it became fully evident how many people were on that boat.
Now, just for orientation's sake, can you just tell us where the boat went? Because the boat winds up fishing on the what banks are they?
Captain Carroll called it the Frisbee Bank, and I don't think that Bill, does that even exist anymore? The Frisbee Bank?
Sure. Paul? It's still Frisbee.
It is Frisbee? Okay, yeah. I haven't heard the term in a long time.
Well known for fishing.
Okay, because that was apparently a favorite spot of Captain Carroll and the Pelican. So when he went out, he actually went around Montauk Point and then went to the south and to the west. And the good news is that was a favorite spot, and the Pelican was known as a lucky boat, and people went there expecting they were going to have a good day of fishing. The bad news was, as they didn't find out until, I guess, too late, is that when the storm was coming in, the storm was approaching, they had to go back, then they had to go to the east and to the north. So they were not going away from the storm as some boat captains were doing, they were going into the storm. So that was that was rather unfortunate. And then, as some of you who read the book know, when Captain Carroll finally said, we have to go in, only his port engine didn't work, which was a total surprise because he had had his engines overhauled earlier that season. So why would a port engine suddenly not work? Then you have an overloaded boat, then you're going into the teeth of the storm, basically. And it's kind of remarkable when you think about it, the Pelican got as close as it did to the lighthouse before it capsized.
So at that point, the wind had changed. It was coming out of the northeast.
Yes.
Right?
Yeah.
So they're essentially going right into the
right.
wind, and the seas were 15 feet?
They got up to 15 feet because, there was times when the Pelican was being hit by waves and the boat was especially when it got stuck in the rip, it was being smacked over and over again on the starboard side. That kept putting the boat over onto the port side, to a point where even Captain Carroll up on the bridge was like underwater for a few seconds here and there. And it's remarkable the Pelican fought its way back as often as it did before finally, I think it got hit with a wave, went over, and before it had a chance to recover, got hit with a second one, and that had it turned turtle.
And the passengers on board didn't want to get wet, so...
Yeah, I'm glad you mentioned that. A lot of the vast majority of the passengers were from New York City, any of the boroughs of New York City. Many of them had not experienced weather like this before while on a boat. Many of them could not swim. So when they found themselves in these increasingly dangerous situation, and they were getting smacked by the wind, and as the waves were hitting the starboard side, I guess it's natural for a lot of people, well, I'm not going to keep standing here getting hit by waves. I'm going to go on the other side and find some protection. What that did, unfortunately, was further overload, unbalanced the weight on the boat, so that it made it even more susceptible to starboard waves and turning it over.
And perhaps even more terrifyingly, some sought refuge down in the cabin of the boat, down below decks.
As far as I know, as I could find out, there were 10 people in the cabin below, and some of them had gone there because they had gotten sick, and then others went there to seek protection. Let's face it, did it ever, as scared as they were, did it ever occur to any of these people the boat could actually capsize? That if it did capsize, that where they were seeking refuge would be an absolutely worst place to be. They couldn't possibly, and some of them were probably so sick that they weren't thinking rationally anyway.
And there was still, even though the weather was turning, there was still a reluctance on some of the fishermen to give up fishing.
Yeah, I think when they were out fishing, Captain Carroll first, when he could see the weather conditions changing, he was hearing some chatter on the radio, and he said to his passengers, "I think we should go in." And here's where I guess Captain Carroll's personality was part of the equation, because there was good fishing going on. His passengers were catching fish, and they were sort of scoffing at the changing weather conditions. Of course, not being experienced, mariners themselves. So they were saying, "Can we stay a little longer? A little longer? Can you give us a little longer?" And Captain Carroll was saying, "Well, I've always tried to be good to my passengers. Okay." And he stayed, approximately another 15, maybe 20 minutes. And with a fast-moving storm, that actually made a difference. Even just those 15 and 20 minutes made a difference.
So what would be different today in those circumstances? The captain would have had better weather information,
yes,
I guess, for one, right?
Yeah. What happened at Fish Shangri-La is that Gene Goebel, that previous afternoon or evening, would put up the weather report that he, as far as he knew, was going to be the next day's weather report. So by the time the next day the captains were taking their boats out, that weather report was 15 hours old, 16 hours old. So that couldn't be terribly reliable. Now, of course, you have up-to-the-minute weather reports. If you put on the Weather Channel, weather stations, radar, satellites. We didn't have any satellites up in the sky that was telling us what the weather was going to be. So, technologically, it's light years in advance of what the captains had access to back in 1951.
So one of the questions that came up, I think, is why the captain doesn't call a mayday. There's a long discussion in the book about the response from the Coast Guard,
yeah,
and actually getting help to the boat. Can you tell us a little bit about why the captain may not have been able to call a mayday, or the delay?
One of the things that I found most painful about the experience of working and researching and writing this book is that it seemed like, not to exonerate Captain Carroll for any of his responsibility, but he also seemed to be the victim of one piece of bad luck after another. Not only his port engine for inexplicably not starting, having to go into the teeth of the storm, not realizing how overloaded his boat was. And then you also had a situation that day, first of all, you don't have the kind of Coast Guard facilities and boats today that you don't have it that you have today. But there had been a call that went into the Coast Guard about 3 guys that were kind of stuck in a boat, I think off Napi. And the Coast Guard boat that was available, went in that direction. So it was going away from Montauk Point. And those 3 guys who were in that boat were able to reach shore, and unfortunately, they just went home. They didn't make a follow-up call and said, "We're safe. If you tell the boat to turn around, it's okay." So when the boat got there, it's like, where are these guys? Oh, then they finally found out they're okay. All right, well, thanks. So by the time, yes, a call went out to the Coast Guard, but and if I remember correctly, I think it was the fellow at the top of the lighthouse, Archie Jones, was that his name? I think it was Archie Jones was the guy at the top of the lighthouse. He saw the Pelican capsize, and he put in a call. But unfortunately, the boat that was available for the Coast Guard, that would have been the best one in those seas to go to the rescue, was like almost an hour away, and it too had to go directly east, and would be affected by the wind to go in that direction. So again, another bad circumstance that was not necessarily. You could say it was the fault of the 3 guys, but and there was a boat that did go out, but it wasn't the best boat that was equipped to go into that kind of weather conditions.
Now, just for orientation, do we know where the boat was when it went down from where we're sitting here?
You know, it's funny, when I was working on the book and I would come out here and talk to different people who would point it out to me, they pointed about 6 different locations.
Was it drifted, right? I mean, it's
It drifted. I mean, it was a mile, a little less than a mile off the Montauk Point, and it was stuck in the rip. So people know where the rip is. It's a combination of, I mean, the connection between the Atlantic Ocean and Block Island Sound. But then it drifted too. So people were seeing the overturned Pelican in different locations.
Right.
You know, there's a location where it actually capsized. There's a location where it drifted after a certain amount of time. Here where it drifted. Here where it drifted. I suppose that the Pelican, and people here are a lot more experienced than I am, or know a lot more knowledgeable about boats than I am, that if it hadn't been for Captain Forsberg and Captain Mundus coming out to do whatever they could do, and actually putting ropes on the Pelican, would it have ended up drifting all the way out into the ocean? I don't know. But the idea was, I mean, you might think, well, why would you still put ropes on the Pelican? It's been capsized and there's nobody left to rescue. I put in the book, as remote as it was there that chance? There was an air pocket in there. And are you going to take a chance there wasn't? No, do what you can to try and get the boat in. So even though Captain Forsberg and Captain Mundus came out, where by the time they arrived, there were no more people in the water, there was still that chance, and thankfully they chose to take that chance rather than just say, oh well, it's too late.
Yeah, there were a series of really truly heroic efforts.
Yeah.
By
was Lester Behan and his first mate Bill.
Right.
You know, they were out in the storm themselves, and the safest thing for Captain Behan on the Bingo 2 to do was just keep going. You know, and because this is a nasty storm, but he couldn't bring himself to do that, so they were responsible for rescuing 12 people. I remember when I was interviewing Bill Blindenhofer's son, who I don't know if he still does, but he lived in Flanders at the time, and I went to his home to interview him, and you know, he was telling me, I guess what his father had passed along about that day, that I mean, Lester Behan and Bill Blindenhofer were definitely heroes. They stayed out in the storm. They rescued 12 people. But apparently his father was so tortured that he didn't get all of them. You know, there were people in the water that actually were racing past the Bingo 2, and he had tied himself to the boat and was dragging them in. He even gaffed a couple of people to help get them into the boat. And yet, he didn't think as much about the 12 people that are still alive because of him. He kept thinking about the ones he didn't get. And you know, sometimes that happens to people who do heroic things. They don't think of themselves as heroes. They think, here's what I didn't do. And that was really a shame. And then he had the Betty Ann, which is a sailboat. I mean, this couple who were out with the wife's parents and a teenage friend, and they were just out for a nice sail. And all of a sudden the storm comes up and the same thing. It would have been their benefit if they just kept going. Let's get out of this. But they also too, they saw a boat in distress, people in the water, and this was one of those things where, you know, the husband was like keeping the boat steady as he could, and his wife was down below, and she was pulling people out of the water. And every so often you hear these stories about, you know, some 12-year-old boy his dad is fixing the spare tire, and something slips and the car falls on the dad. This 12-year-old boy somehow lifts the car off his father, this superhuman strength. This petite woman was lifting people who weighed more than her. Soaking wet. Heavy clothing, was lifting these people out of the water, and thanks to the Betty Ann, 6 people were rescued.
And the Bingo 2 had a charter of its own.
Yes.
So there were fishermen on board the Bingo 2.
Yeah.
Do we know if those fishermen helped out at all? Because the story is really about Captain Behan and his
Bill
mate.
Blindenhofer, yeah.
But no, I don't get a sense that the fishermen themselves were jumping up and
you know, that I have to admit, I think that's a bit of a blind spot in the book, because I couldn't get information about. I mean, I'd heard one story that he had gone in and dropped off his passengers and come back out, but I don't think that made sense. because, you know,
there pretty quickly.
because they were able to rescue 12 people. I don't think there would have been that many people left if they'd come back out. So what were these passengers doing? Presumably, as Bill was hauling them out and putting them in the boat, but I think they were putting blankets on them. They probably giving them water, holding their hand, whatever they could do. Because as you can imagine, some of these people were terribly traumatized.
Yeah.
You know, they were shocked to be alive. They thought for sure they weren't going to make it. Suddenly there's a guy reaching over and dragging them out of the water, even using a gaff if he had to. And so I think that's probably what happened, but I couldn't tell you for certain.
A couple of things that, as we got towards the end of the book and about the end of the experience, you talk about how there was, it became very innovative, how the spaces, the yacht club and Durier's Ice House
Yes.
were used.
The yacht club that night was supposed to hold a big dinner, you know, Labor Day weekend dinner, and they were preparing the yacht club for a dinner and a dance and everything. And then when the word came in, I think Roland McCann, I think, was the manager of the yacht club. When he got word that there was a boat capsized, there were survivors, and they were bringing him in. Suddenly, they totally pivoted, and the yacht club became a triage center. You know, it became an emergency room, and so people were brought there, and people were showing up from different parts of Montauk. They were bringing blankets, clothing, hot soup, hot coffee. So the community, on a dime, really rallied to take care of these people, because you know, there was no clinic available. You mentioned the ice house. Obviously, there were more bodies than could possibly be accommodated in the few facilities that Montauk had. So the Durier family basically donated their ice house as a place as a temporary morgue. You also didn't have an ambulance. You know, one of the silver lining of the Montauk, the Pelican tragedy, is that there's a direct connection you can make between that and the creation of the Montauk ambulance, I think in 1952. So you had to put these people somewhere. I remember when I interviewed Jimmy Hewitt, and I think he was 11 years old at the time, and his father had gone down apparently to help out in any way he could, and then said to his son, "Don't go down there." Well, when you're 11 years old,
That means go down there.
that means I'll find a way down there. And he happened to be wandering around, and he stepped into the ice house, and it was a sight he would never, you know, it was a horrible sight, one he would never forget. And it was, you know, when I interviewed him, it was more than 50 years later, but it was a very vivid memory still for him.
Well, there's a photo in the book that I find very striking of that.
Yeah.
And at first, when I looked at it, I thought, well, these are people lying down and they're motioning. And then I realized they're in a position of rigor mortis, from where they may have been grasping, trying to hold on to something.
Yeah. One of the difficulties of the book is that I wanted to be very sensitive to family members, because you know, there's a way to have written some of the things in this book that could have been more graphic, more disturbing. But I knew that there would be family members, I assumed there would be family members reading this book. So I was trying to be as discreet as possible, but also convey, you know, how terrible the situation was. And I think I was also feeling that way too, because I was able to interview 3 of the survivors. Anthony Testa, Seymour Gavin, and Berger. I'm trying to remember his first name, Berger. And so when I was interviewing these people, I think all 3 of them were in their, because this was more than 50 years after the event, were in their 70s, late 60s. And they would tell me that to that day, you know, over 5 decades later, they would still wake up sometimes screaming or in cold sweats from the nightmares that they had from their experiences. And so hearing the pain still in their voice all those years later made me realize that that's also going to be true of the relatives of the people who perished. So don't be cruel. Don't for sensationalism's sake, don't be that, any more graphic than you have to be to just tell the story in as clear a way as possible.
After the book came out, I understand you wound up talking to some other people that were related, or did you learn anything from those other conversations that you wish you would be able to get into the book, or learn anything new?
I certainly learned things. There's probably a few details here and there that I would have put into the book if I knew about them. But on the other hand, it wasn't like I felt like I shortchanged my research. You know, I talked to as many people. You look in the acknowledgments, there's a lot of people listed. I want to give a special thank you to the Montauk Library and their local history collection. Robin Strong was the curator at that time. I mean, so many trips I made. It was in the basement. I don't know where the local history room is going to be when the new Montauk Library opens up, but at that time it was in the basement. And to go there and she would provide me with audio tapes of people talking about their fishing experiences, and some of them had been out in the water that day. So even if they were no longer around to interview personally, I could take notes from their reminiscences that were on audio tape. So the other thing I learned is it confirmed for me when I would give talks, for example, in 2005 when the book came out, 2006, that sometimes would be attended by family members, that it confirmed for me that trying to be as discreet, yet tell the story as clearly as possible, but being discreet and sensitive was the right thing to do.
You mentioned that one of the silver linings was the birth of the Montauk ambulance.
Yes.
And if I remember reading, there was a car dealership from up in Queens that donated a station wagon.
Yeah, a fellow in Queens donated a station wagon to Montauk Fire Department and said, "Let this be the story of your ambulance corps." And, yeah, Bill?
Russell McGrady.
Russell McGrady, okay. And that was how Montauk began its ambulance corps. It was a donated car from a Queens dealership. And presumably they have improved their transportation ability since then. But also I think an interesting part of the story was I interviewed a woman who was a nurse trainee at Southampton Hospital, which of course is a very different facility then than it is today. And she was a nurse trainee, and what they expected would be an extremely quiet Saturday afternoon. And all of a sudden, they started getting these calls, like, we're bringing people to the hospital. What happened? So I think if there were two words that were said over and over and over again that day, it was, what happened? What happened? What happened? And then when you tell them, well, a boat capsized off Montauk, it was like, really? No, that couldn't happen. I was talking to someone here a little while ago who said, well, as far as like in the city it was concerned, the weather wasn't that bad, it was no big deal. Yet 100 miles away, it was a very different situation. So as in radio stations, you know, think of the stations that probably were broadcasting in 1951, WOR, WCBS, you know. I remember in WOR they had Clavin and Finch. But at least they would tell me. To have these reports about a boat capsizing, like, how could that possibly happen? It must be the boat's fault. It's not like there's bad weather. So it wasn't until the headlines were in the Daily Mirror, Daily News, New York Times, other publications came out the next day and on Monday that people realized the full extent of what had gone on.
The other silver lining might be the legislation that came about as a result of this.
Yeah, it didn't happen overnight. You know, it took a few years to write the new rules and regulations, to get it passed by Congress, and it was finally signed by President Eisenhower. And it did put in restrictions on a number of people on a boat. It made regulations. It made, if I remember correctly, I think it made it a little more rigorous how to be a first mate on a boat. You know, I don't want to. Certainly, the first mate on the Pelican was not responsible for what happened. But his main occupation is he's a short order cook. And so he was basically there to help the captain collect fares and just do basic things, so that when the tragedy happened, I mean, again, I was mentioning this to somebody else, when that port engine didn't begin and the captain said, see if you can find anything, well, he sticks his head in. He had no idea where to even begin to look to see where the problem was. And then he compounds that by pops his head back up and says, does anybody know anything about engines? You know, that's not, how reassuring is that to the people on the boat? So I think you had to have a little more training, a little more expertise, and the captains themselves, as Captain McBride mentioned. I mean, how much hours and hours and hours of education training the captains have to go through now compared to what was happening, you know, in 1951.
Mia, do we have Mia out there?
Yeah, there she is.
Oh. Do we have time for questions from the audience? So let's start with that. Do we have any questions from people out in the audience?
Sure. I was about 2.5, 3 feet high, and I was standing in the cockpit of my father's first sport fishing boat at the yacht club. And we didn't go out because the weather, by the time we decided to go, was already turned bad. But all of a sudden, it was raining, it was blowing. All of a sudden, people were coming down the dock at the yacht club. And it was strange because people were holding them and they were wrapped in blankets.
Yeah.
And I was probably 6 years old. I had no idea what it was, and until years later, it's sort of like I put 2 and 2 together. But my parents didn't explain to me what had happened. Paul his whole family was involved.
Yeah. Yeah.
I would have been on a boat probably with my father. My father tells the story. He came in, and when he got to the dock, he was notified people were running down. The boat turned. So he and his mate got the people off the boat right away. They just threw everything up on the dock and just told them, get out of the way, let the engine run, and went right back out. And I was hitchhiking from Amagansett at the time, coming to Montauk, and I got there right after he left. Because I heard him. And he and Frank Bundes got to the boat. Now, there was a bubble in the boat. That's the only thing that held it afloat. And he kept saying that there's got to be some people, okay, in that bubble. So they both got the tow line on the boat. Now the boat went down up in here someplace where I told him. And it came around the lighthouse on the other side against the wind, northeast wind. So when the tide turned, they couldn't get the boat to come in between the two boats towing them side by side. And that's how they got into the shadow before the Coast Guard took over the tow. That's in the book. Very well documented. And he did a great job.
Yeah, thanks.
One thing that did come out of this whole thing, people lost their life. It was a terrible tragedy, but it made fishing boats a lot safer. We have great, safe boats right now. And it's a great situation between the Coast Guard and the boatmen, the fishermen, that it's just made them to get together. We come up with realistic regulations for the boats. Once again, that was in the old Montauk Firehouse, where afterwards my father would take me to the Montauk Boat Association meeting, and they were working together, Montauk fishermen and the Coast Guard, to make the boats safer, how we could limit it, and how we could have a better understanding between the Coast Guard and industry. And that came out, and right now, as I stand here, small passenger carrier boats are the safest fishing vessels in the world right now. New fishing.
Anyone else? Yes.
Did the railroad ever take any kind of responsibility? Because it sounds like this may have been a problem that was being compounded. There were no checks on the number of passengers. I mean, was there ever any blame put on the railroad?
That's a great question, because when you think about it, which obviously you have, one of the seeds for this tragedy began in New York City, because that there was, just like with the boats at the time, which basically were unrestricted with how many people you could fit on, as many people as you had life preservers. People were just crammed into these trains. You know, if you bought your ticket, if you could find a place to stand, forget sitting, if you could find a little space to stand, you took that train all the way out there. And so, yes, I think that was part of the cause of what eventually happened, but my recollection is I don't think the railroad took any... Yeah, go ahead, Bill.
in doing my research, I found that there was a lawsuit afterwards that involved the railroads being irresponsible, and they shut the train down, which is one of the main reasons why Fish Shangri-La shut down afterwards.
Yeah.
And that's when even those boats that were still there moved into the harbor.
This was a major loss of life in peacetime. To have 45 people die like that, all in the space of an hour. So it definitely affected the fishing industry. It took years. I mean, you gentlemen who are captains can tell a lot better than I could, but it put a lot of captains in jeopardy because they continue to make a living. So if some of them were able to endure that, some they couldn't.
Yes.
Not to be too legalistic, but given what actually happened, were there any major lawsuits filed against the companies, or was it?
Yeah, there were lawsuits. Some of the families, I talk about this a bit in the book. I think it's in the epilogue of the last chapters that many of the families wanted to sue. The thing was, who do you sue? You know, Captain Carroll perished. He probably didn't have much to begin with, even if he had lived. But there really was no estate to sue. The one who was basically left to sue was Fish Shangri-La and Gene Goble. But my recollection is that they ended up coming down to where they picked one plaintiff that looked like it might have the strongest case, and the courts did not agree with that case. So my recollection, I don't think anybody from a legal standpoint made anything out of the tragedy.
Yes, ma'am.
I just wanted to know, I know the life jackets, they didn't have enough, right, on the thing?
They actually had more life jackets than there were people on board.
Oh, well, they didn't have time to put them on?
We did. According to when I interviewed several of the survivors, only one man put on a life preserver, a man named Griffin. And all the other passengers made fun of him and ridiculed him. Because it was like, first of all, you're going to jinx us. You have so little faith in the captain. Maybe in a subtle way or maybe a more overt way, questioning his manhood. You know, you're making us all look bad here, look foolish by putting a life preserver on. As it happened, that was one of the survivors, that gentleman.
Yeah, I'm sure.
Whatever the writing merits of the book, whatever its other merits, I do think, from what I've been told, it's helped the relatives of those people at least find out what happened that day. I mean, there was coverage at the time. Some of it was accurate, some of it was not. But what I tried to do was make the information in the book as accurate as possible, so they would know, even if their relative was not specifically mentioned, because I couldn't tell the story of everybody on that boat, but at least you have a pretty good idea of what went on that day, so it's going to be less of a mystery of how your relative perished. So I hope it worked.
My name is Henry Osmers. I'm the historian for the Montauk Point Lighthouse, and with me is Faye Pakula. She is a relative of some members of the Pelican disaster of 1951, relatives that unfortunately were lost in that tragedy. Faye, we spoke during the week you called the office, and I remember when you asked me about the event, and I said, do you plan on coming? You said you felt like you had to. And that piqued my interest. And tell me why that was.
Well, my both uncles drowned on the Pelican. I was 6 years old, and my father was supposed to go, but he had a printing business, and he had to get a job out, and he said, I'll go with you next time. They used to go like once a month fishing, and they loved it. And unfortunately, they asked a neighbor to go instead of my dad, and the neighbor perished on the boat. And I understand from my cousin that her mother's brother was supposed to go, and his wife was pregnant, and she said, you're not going anywhere. And he survived because his wife would not let him go on the fishing boat that day. And my dad hung up his fishing rod and he never spoke of it again. We knew very few particulars about it. And my cousin told me about Dark Noon, known, and I was so appreciative to Mr. Clavin for writing it because it opened up a lot of, it answered a lot of questions that I had growing up. And it was a terrible tragedy, and unfortunately, if they knew then what they know now, many lives could have been saved.
And if I remember right, I think you had said that your father had originally planned to go,
Yes.
but then something had come up, and he was the one who invited the neighbor, right?
No,
Was
my
he-
uncle's invited.
Oh, your
me.
uncle's invited
Yeah.
him. Oh, okay. But then your dad felt...
My dad had survivor's guilt, is that what you mean?
Yes.
His whole life, and I never knew that until he was terminally ill himself. He never spoke of it.
So all those years, no one ever mentioned
No.
what that was all about.
No.
Well, when you found out your uncles were gone, what did they say about that?
Oh well, the day the tragedy happened, I knew. They called my father right away, and everybody was crying. But after everything was settled, for years nobody spoke of it again. My cousins, went their separate ways. Their mothers picked up their lives as best as they could, and nobody really spoke about it again.
Had these people in your family ever fished at Montauk before?
Oh, my father used to go all the time to Montauk. I always remember that they went to. In fact, once my father bought a watch for my mother, and my uncles were in the backyard with my dad, and he had a fish. It was a shark, a baby shark, and he put the watch in the shark's mouth and took it out to surprise my mother.
Oh gosh.
And my uncles were there, and everybody was laughing because, I remember it was a baby shark, and,
Did you ever, over the years, think about coming out here on your own, even regardless of this event?
Well, I came here with my family. We just wanted to do something one day. But I always had not a great feeling about Montauk, It always was like a stigma in my brain. And I never learned how to swim. I never liked boats. It was all, but my cousin had a boat. It didn't, just the way it affected me personally.
It's probably all just attached to this one event.
Yeah.
And you were saying before about during the talk when Tom had mentioned about people who could swim as opposed to who didn't know how to swim.
My uncles didn't know how to swim.
They didn't know how.
Yeah. And one uncle went through the whole war, the younger Victor, and he was in the Marines. His daughter said even though he was short, he was in the Marines. And he got hurt, but not severely hurt. He came home and went fishing and lost his life like that. But he went through the whole war and everything, and nothing happened.
You flew in from Louisiana for this event?
From New Orleans, sure.
From New Orleans?
Yes, absolutely.
I'm so glad.
And better yet, my son joined me from Los Angeles. So
Yeah, so it was kind of a, auspicious, fact that it had been delayed, and my father found out through his friend, and we just talked about it, and I said, of course I'll come. And
What did you just discover when you spoke to Gloria?
Because there was no body. She went to the beaches for a year.
I'm looking.
But she doesn't, she never washed up. His friend never did either. Just those issues. This was important to us. This was not something we took lightly. We came off, we all got together.
So glad you came.
As the grandson, I'm curious, how has this informed your life?
yeah, so this has always been a big mystery to me. I've had just some very few stories that my grandmother had told me about that time in her life, and I knew, it was a very tragic event. And really had one conversation with her that I can remember where she recounted some of the details. And just learning, that it was such a big ordeal, and there's so many people involved. I didn't know the extent of the tragedy.
Yeah, I wonder if that's comforting in some way to know that it was a tragedy that was shared by so many people.
I mean, it's definitely eye-opening to me, like to realize, you know, that 70 years later, you know, people are still memorializing this event. You know, I always thought of it as like a personal family thing, you know, and I didn't realize how many lives it had affected.
Do you know how your mother found out?
I don't know. I honestly don't know that.
When you were a tiny baby.
Did it create an aversion to boating or fishing for you? Oddly enough.
No, I've been drawn to it.
Yeah.
Really?
I've been an avid boater. I've sailed quite a bit in these waters. We've cruised up and down the Sound, out to the Vineyard and Nantucket and all that. And I just actually bought a new boat and shipped it down to New Orleans. So
wow.
Looking to, yeah. So it's I've been drawn to it really. So
maybe so today for you all being here is just special for us also.
Yeah, it really meant a lot to us. It really meant a lot to us.
Thanks for saying that.
And I would call this a silver lining too, that we're here. Seriously.
This is good for us.
Yes. Yeah.